Let us make a start. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Academic Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. I'm also one of the co-organisers of the event of which this session is part. That's the European School of Literary Translation. So this is an annual event which has been taking place online for the last 3 years and is otherwise held in Italy in September. And it's an event which brings together 15 to 20 translators and translation educators each year for a Training the Trainer week of online activities, this year themed on the topic of translators collaborating, working with others. And so welcome to those who are joining us from outside of the ESLT program. So we're working on various platforms simultaneously at the moment. We're working on a Zoom webinar and on YouTube. And so I think the technology is behaving itself. I should say that we are recording this session as well, just so that everyone knows. I will introduce our speaker in a moment, but just to say that we will have an opportunity at the end for a question and answer session. And so we're using the Zoom webinar format, which includes both chat and Q&A. So do feel free, audience members, to use both. The good thing about Q&A is that you can see other people's questions and respond to them and express your preferences there. Do please use the opportunity to put questions to our speaker because, as I say, we will have time at the end. It's time to introduce our speaker then. This is our first plenary session of ESLT 2022, and it's an absolute delight to welcome back Ros Schwartz, who was our first plenary speaker at our first European School of Literary Translation in Rome. And so, Ros, we're meeting in different circumstances online this year, but it's great to have you back. And it was kind of a no-brainer when we decided on the topic this year. When we're speaking about collaborations, Ros, as we will be hearing, has collaborated in a great many ways with a great many fellow translators and others over her distinguished translation career. Since 1981, Ros Schwartz has translated some 100 fiction and non-fiction titles from French. In 2010, she published a new translation of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince, and she's currently one of the team retranslating Georges Simenon's oeuvre for Penguin Classics. In 2009, she was made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and in 2017, she was the recipient of the UK Institute of Translation and Interpreting's John Sykes Memorial Prize for Excellence. Ros gives talks, workshops, and masterclasses around the world, from Calcutta to Yaoundé, and is co-director of Bristol Translates Literary Translation Summer School. And I think we'll be hearing more about that in Ros's talk. This year, Ros and Daniel Hahn launched a translator residency scheme in association with 3 UK universities and regional literature agencies funded by Arts Council England. Ros was co-chair of English Pen's translation programme until earlier this year. So without further ado, we have 1 hour for this session altogether. And can I welcome on your behalf, Ros. Welcome back to ESLT, and we look forward hugely to your talk, which has the title On the Same Page.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and it's a great pleasure to be back. I just want to say that the talk will be available as a PDF afterwards, so you don't need to take notes. All the organisations that I mentioned, there'll be links in the PDF. And this will be distributed afterwards. So in this talk, I shall be exploring different forms of collaboration that translators are and can be involved in, both within the profession and outside it, nationally and internationally. Translation is often said to be an isolated profession, but once I started thinking about the ways in which it can be and is collaborative, I came up with a whole range of different and highly rewarding examples of collaboration, all of which I have personally experienced. First of all, there's collaboration with living authors. This, of course, depends on the author, whether or not they know your language, and the degree to which they want to be involved in the translation process. Some prefer to be left alone and simply answer queries, whereas others like to roll up their sleeves and engage, and they can sometimes become over-involved when they think they know your language better than you do. I always seek out the authors I translate in person, if possible, and try to capture the voice behind the words on the page. This has led to some illuminating conversations and lifelong friendships. Deborah Smith, who ventured to learn Korean in order to remedy the absence of translations into English from that language, worked closely with the author Han Kang to translate The Vegetarian, which won the first International Booker Prize and put both author and translator firmly on the literary map. And it is thanks to translator Jennifer Croft's dogged persistence for a decade that Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk's work was first published in English by the then fledgling publisher Fitzcarraldo. These bold translator-led collaborations have paved the way for other translators to follow suit and for publishers to be more open to approaches from translators championing works they're passionate about. A form of collaboration that I have practiced and see as a way of developing professionally is working with a co-translator. There are many reasons for working as a pair. The first time I did so was purely pragmatic, a mass market novel needing to be done fast. My co-translator and I split the book down the middle and revised each other's sections to harmonize the style and vocabulary. We thought it would be straightforward, but it turned out to be a real eye-opener and a humbling experience. It was like having a mirror held up, and I learned a great deal that helped make me a better translator. The second time was when a book my colleague Lulu Norman had pitched to a publisher was finally accepted. But by that time, she was no longer available. She generously passed on my name. However, I knew it was a project close to her heart, so we agreed that I'd draft the translation and then Lulu would come in as a second pair of eyes. Again, I discovered a lot about my foibles and my weaknesses and strengths, which complemented those of Lulu. We brainstormed to thrash out tricky problems, and I believe the translation was 10 times better than it would have been had either of us done it alone. An accumulation of myriad tiny improvements that had the overall effect of lifting the translation to a whole new level. Another novel I co-translated was written in 2 voices, and it was much easier to create 2 very different narrative voices by having 2 very different translators. I'm often asked how is it possible to work as a pair on a practical level. This is not a method that works for everyone. First of all, you need to be certain that you and your prospective co-translator are compatible. By that, I mean that you have a shared linguistic sensibility and a similar appreciation of the source text, and a humility to accept criticism. You also need to be sure that person is reliable with regard to deadlines. I would advise anyone thinking of embarking on a co-translation to do a trial few pages to see if the partnership will work. You need to be open to suggestions and prepared to put aside your pride and ego. It's not about bargaining, as in, well, I agreed to X number of your changes, so now you should agree to mine. Both translators need to be 100% committed to what works best for the book. It's instructive to see how many improvements a second pair of eyes can bring. The ideal partnership is when one translator responds to the other's suggestions with, of course, why didn't I think of that in the first place? It's also important to agree on how your names will appear on the credits and ideally the cover. I know of translators who have fallen out at this stage. Should it be alphabetically? Or if one translator has done the bulk of the work and the other has acted as more of an editor, should their name appear first? The key thing is to be clear from the start. So these are the pros of co-translating. Enhanced quality, especially when under pressure of time. It's an invaluable form of professional development. It's a safety net. Your co-translator will pick up any mistakes and we will make them. Complementary strengths, so one might be better at dialogue and slang and the other better at formal language. And publishers are generally receptive to co-translations as it reduces the editing at their end, so long as the financial arrangements are clear. It speeds up the process and allows both translators to fit in other work. It's reassuring to have a partner with whom to discuss translation problems. A co-translator often encourages bold solutions when alone you may hesitate. And then if you're hit by a life crisis, especially in today's unpredictable times of COVID, you have backup. Quite simply, you feel less isolated. But there are some downsides. It has to be said that this is not a lucrative way of working because the fee does not increase proportionately. And of course, you have to share the credit and any prizes. But for me, in terms of professional development and sheer creative satisfaction and joy, co-translating is deeply rewarding. So another form of collaboration is that between a speaker of the source language and a target language translator. This is one way of overcoming the difficulty when there is no history of published translations from that language, and consequently, there are no established translators. For example, Karim Abdulrahman, a Kurdish journalist working for the BBC, collaborated with an English colleague to translate the work of prominent Iraqi Kurdish novelist Bakhtiar Ali's I Stared at the Night of the City. This was the first Kurdish novel ever to be translated into English, thanks to this collaboration. This model of co-translation can be encouraged in the university setting where there are likely to be students with complementary language pairs. A simple form of cross-fertilization between translators working from different languages is the translation surgery format, either in real life or online. Participants, ideally up to around 10, each present a thorny translation issue they're struggling to resolve and throw it open to the group to discuss. It's always interesting to see how certain problems prove not to be language specific and how a translator working from a very different language can offer a solution. This is easy to organize, especially within a university environment where students are translating from a range of languages, and it costs nothing. Günter Grass famously used to organize regular get-togethers of all his translators at his home so they could thrash out translation problems in a convivial setting. Not many authors are simultaneously translated into numerous languages, but it is always enlightening to swap notes with translators of the same works into different languages and to hear about the solutions they have found to the challenges that arise. In this age of easy online communication, I would encourage translators to seek out colleagues who have already translated the book into other languages or who are engaged in its translation and to enter into a dialogue. Jennifer Croft, in an interview for the Paris Review, talks about meeting some of Olga Tokarczuk's translators. This is a quote from Jennifer. There was a translation festival in the northern part of Poland with a panel dedicated to Olga and her translators. She had this entourage of translators, some of whom have been with her for 20 years, and it's really powerful to be in their company. We're so supportive of each other, and we have a little Facebook group, and we exchange emails about specific books that we're translating, if there are any little tricks that we need to be aware of. It's a really interesting, weird, nice community to be a part of. End of quote. And as translators, we are ideally positioned to share information about a book we're passionate about with colleagues working into different languages if the book hasn't been picked up by a publisher in their country. We have a role to play in the dissemination of international literature, especially when it comes to publications from small independent presses. Moving on from collaboration between translators, I'd like to talk about collaboration between translators and other actors in the publishing process. Editors, friend or foe. I should perhaps first clarify what I mean by editor, because I'm aware that in different languages there are different terms which, unlike the English word, often contain the notion of correcteur or réviseur in French, implying someone who judges and corrects and removes agency from the translator. The ideal copy editor is someone who spots spelling and grammatical errors and points out infelicities, giving the translator the opportunity to address these and to have the final say. It's a very subtle skill and one that is invaluable, but often undervalued. The copy editor is even more invisible than the translator. I've been fortunate to work with some brilliant copy editors who have taught me a great deal. I've also worked with some not so brilliant copy editors who have ridden roughshod over my work. I would like to see more workshops bringing together translators and editors to give each an appreciation and understanding of the other's role. In 2008, members of the Translators Association organised a one-day symposium in London, bringing together translators, publishers and editors to do just this, which resulted in a publication, Translation in Practice, published by Dalkey Archive Press. This can be downloaded from the Translators Association website, and there's a link in the PDF. Again, this type of symposium can be organised within the university context to give students an understanding of the realities of publishing and editors a better understanding of the translation process. Translators need an extensive network of family and friends working in different fields to consult on specific vocabulary questions. When translating children's books, I've been fortunate that my own kids have been the age of the target reader. In fact, my daughter Chloe was instrumental in working with me on the translation of Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince. And I literally mean instrumental. Chloe is very musical and has an acute ear for sound and rhythm. She worked with me on the lyricism of the English text. And before you ask, she has her name on the title page alongside mine, and every year we go on a special trip together, funded by our royalties. I recently had a difference of opinion with my publisher over how children would understand the word monstrous. To prove my point, I recorded interviews with a number of friends' kids who all spontaneously defined the word in the way I was arguing it would be received. The publisher rolled over. Publishers don't always realise that the translator can be an asset to the publicity campaign around their translation. Through our contacts and social networks, we can help create a buzz as well as take part in public events, for which we should be paid, of course. We need to remind publishers that our involvement doesn't stop when we deliver our manuscript. Here's an example of an initiative I organised. When my translation of The Little Prince was published in 2010, I knew that my friend and colleague Sarah Ardizzoni was about to publish her translation of a graphic novel version by Johann Safar. Sarah and I co-wrote an article about our different translation strategies, and we arranged a live event at the French Institute in London, which garnered review coverage in the Financial Times, among others. Translators are very active in promoting each other's work, and recent initiatives in the Anglosphere include online platforms such as Translators Aloud, which invites translators to read from their work and has a Translations Seeking a Publisher section. There is also the World Kidslit website, both of these set up and managed by dedicated translator colleagues to promote their fellow translators' work. Moving from national to international collaboration between translators. This is vital when it comes to sharing information on contracts and working conditions and learning from other countries' successes in these areas to help improve translators' working conditions everywhere. Seattle, the European Council of Literary Translators Associations, has been a prime mover in instigating Europe-wide surveys and sharing information and strategies to help empower member associations. It publishes the bilingual online magazine Counterpoint as a means of sharing ideas and stimulating discussion. And recent years have seen increased dialogue between UK and US translator associations to ensure that translators receive fair treatment on both sides of the Atlantic. And of course, informal exchanges go on all the time. There's a great deal of scope for international collaboration in profile-raising initiatives. A shining example is Women in Translation Month. The idea was sparked in 2013 by a series of independent observations on the dearth of women writers in translation, first by translator Alison Anderson and later by blogger Maytal Radzinski. In 2014, Maytal launched Women in Translation Month in August of that year to honour women writers and translators from around the world and to show how women have shaped the international exchange of literature. A Facebook group was set up and translators from all over the globe suggested titles. Another colleague designed a logo. Within days, there was a comprehensive list of titles by women writers in English translation. The word spread, and translators publicised the initiative to their local bookshops, who loved the idea, August being a dead month. Many of them found that they had quite a few of the books in stock anyway, and this provided a useful display concept and talking point. And from this little seed sprang the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation. Now in its 6th year, the University of Warwick picked up the baton and instigated this prize, which this year has attracted 138 entries from 33 languages. And inspired by the pioneering work of the Women in Translation Month founders, publisher and other stories committed to publishing only books by women writers for an entire year. This initiative and its offshoots is a perfect example of the collaborative power of the international translator community. Translators are an important link between the publishing world and academia, bridging the gap between theory and practice. Summer schools hosted by universities and tutored by practitioners, such as those run by the British Centre for Literary Translation and Bristol Translates in the UK, offer two models. Whereas the BCLT summer school comes within the remit of the centre's activities, Bristol Translates is a translator-led project created by Amanda Hopkinson and myself. We have held the summer school under the auspices of different institutions over the past 10 years, including City University and the Universities of Warwick and Bristol. The host university provides the infrastructure while we're responsible for the content. We have complete autonomy in appointing the tutors and developing the programme, which is very much hands-on. The format of the summer school is a combination of single language and multi-language workshops and industry talks and panel sessions. In the feedback we receive, attendees say how much they value the collaborative collegial ethos of the summer school. Although not primarily an income-generating activity, the university benefits from the expertise and experience of leading translators in each language and from the summer school's reputation. In addition, the summer school also attracts students to the university's translation programme, as I'm sure it does at BCLT as well. I know many of you teach translation in a university context. Laura Talon, a translation trainer on the master's programme in specialised translation and interpreting at Porto Polytechnic in Portugal, points out in a recent blog that, and I quote, "Translation training has definitely moved away from what came to be known as the transmissionist approach, and teachers no longer provide the authoritative version of a translated text. On the contrary, students are encouraged to consider several equally adequate possibilities for the same source text. Rather than the actual product, it is the translation process that is focused on in the class. The reasoning behind a certain choice is sometimes more important than the choice itself. Translation mistakes are therefore incorporated as learning opportunities instead of just dismissed as errors. Instrumental to these dynamics are collaborative learning strategies in which students play an active role, taking responsibility for their own learning process and acquiring a set of essential competencies, translational, interpersonal, technological, along the way. Although there's a wide variety of collaborative learning activities, most translation teachers find it useful to make students work in groups of 2 or more, using project-based assignments that try to replicate actual workplace conditions. Active discussion and brainstorming are encouraged as problem-solving activities that publicly unfold learning. Assessment is often based on students' portfolios, and conventional tests are eliminated whenever possible. When grading is unavoidable, it takes into account self and peer assessment, the degree of the students' engagement, and their contribution to the cooperative effort. End quote. Inviting practitioners to give masterclasses and workshops is another way in which universities can collaborate with practicing translators to give students an insight into the realities of the publishing world. Another is translator residencies, as Duncan mentioned, building on the residency culture already developed with institutions such as the British Library and the Free Word Centre, which no longer exists but was a hub for free speech and literary organisations. Fellow translactivist Danny Hahn and I have recently set up an Arts Council England funded residency programme involving 3 universities, 2 regional literature development agencies and 3 practicing translators, with the aim of bringing together town and gown. The resident translators work with the university where they are based and with the Literature Development Agency to organise events both within the university and in the wider community in association with local partners to stimulate interest in translated literature. Universities often have access to funding sources that translation organisations don't. A project I was involved in was one created by the University of Bristol in association with Bakwa Books in Yaoundé, Cameroon, to train emerging writers and literary translators in that country. The project leader secured funding from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, which funds academic research, and several translation practitioners were invited to lead the workshops. I would urge you to investigate whether there are funding opportunities for bringing together academia and the translation profession in your country. Translator training need not only take place within universities. While there are numerous undergraduate and postgraduate courses, there is little in the way of professional development for mid-career translators, and this is where peer training has a vital role to play. In the UK, we celebrate St. Jerome's Day with International Translation Day, organised in association with English Pen. This is very much an industry-facing event with panel sessions and workshops aimed at practicing translators keen to up their game. We also have a translation centre at the London Book Fair, which is more public-facing, with talks and discussions turning the spotlight on translators and translated literature. Do encourage your students to attend such events, many of which are now hybrid and can be accessed from anywhere. They offer not only a wealth of ideas, but are also important networking platforms. Just as the profession collaborates with English Pen, which publishes the international e-zine Pen Transmissions, another rich forum for dialogue, there are possibilities for working with national literature bodies and institutes like the Institut Français, the Goethe Institute, and so on. For translators, offering to run workshops, reading groups, instigating and taking part in author events at book festivals, etc. And such collaborations can lead to exciting opportunities for translators to travel and have creative exchanges. The most inspirational example of a translator-led multilingual, multimedia collaboration with musicians and a visual artist is the very recent event conceived and directed by translator Sarah Ardizzoni at this year's Edinburgh International Book Festival, featuring her translation of Faiza Gen's latest novel, Discretion. Sarah created the project, raised the funds, and directed the performance. There's a link to the event, which you can watch for free until the end of September in the PDF of my talk, and I highly recommend it. You're in for a real treat. Speaking for myself, I have participated in book festivals and conferences and given masterclasses around the UK and in Jaipur, Delhi, Kolkata, Quebec, Norway, France, Belgium, Lithuania, and Shanghai, among others, each time making new connections and garnering fresh ideas. One of the things I most value about our profession is the generosity of colleagues, whether it is through peer-led workshops, such as the one being offered by Katie Derbyshire, who translates from German and hosted by the BCLT, to give mid-career translators an opportunity to hone their skills, or through information sharing via the various forums and networks, through passing on work and mentoring. This collegial spirit can be fostered in a number of ways, particularly by encouraging students to team up with a buddy to revise each other's work or to meet in informal groups, either in person or online. These cost nothing and can have an immense benefit in boosting participants' confidence. A few years ago, a group of emerging translators set up an international online forum, the Emerging Translators Network, which is a source of support, advice, and encouragement for translators working into English. It's a format that can easily be replicated by translators working into other languages. Mentoring is another valuable form of collaboration, and in my view, one of the best ways to support emerging translators. The close one-on-one collaboration benefits the mentee for sure, but also the mentor and the profession as a whole, because we all want to see literary translation thrive and to encourage the next generation of translators for it to do so. We're fortunate in the UK to have a tried and tested funded mentoring programme led by the National Centre for Writing. Again, I would urge those of you present to explore the possibilities for setting up a mentoring scheme, if there isn't one in your country, through the relevant cultural and translation organisations. An exemplary format is the programme developed by the Université Charles V in Paris at the instigation of the professional translators involved in the teaching. It includes not only translation training within the university, but also a mentoring component with paid mentors and an internship in a publishing house. This combination joins up all the dots between theory, practice, and the realities of the publishing world. I have briefly outlined some of the ways in which collaboration takes place within our profession. Translation is anything but an isolated activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Roz. What a wonderful tour d'horizon of collaborative opportunities, and that's really as a keynote address to our week where we're thinking about translators working with others. It could not be better. Thank you so much, Roz. And I'm sure there are plenty of questions from those in our audience. The chat function is working for everybody, and we've had one question already come through on the Q&A. So I'm sure Roz's remarks will chime with the experiences of those in our audience, but perhaps you've had different experiences of collaborating. Perhaps you've had experiences which have been less helpful than Roz's, as she was describing in her talk. Roz was speaking mainly about the Anglosphere, and perhaps you've rather different experiences of translating between different languages or different kinds of collaboration, which Roz didn't touch on, although she touched on plenty. So do please, if you have any comments or any questions for Roz, do please pop them in the Q&A or in the chat. I just, as Roz was closing, I posted the PDF of Roz's talk so that you have the links, all the wonderful resources that Roz was mentioning in her talk. And I also put a link onto the YouTube, in the YouTube chat, for those, I'm not able to upload the talk itself, the PDF on YouTube, but if you send a message to the email address that I posted in the YouTube chat, then we'll be able to send you the PDF as well. Roz, I wonder, were you, because I think it's wonderful the way you've kind of demonstrated this kind of cliche really about, oh gosh, the translator in that ivory tower, how it's just not the case, or at least it hasn't been the case for you. And I wonder whether this has surprised you, whether perhaps at the beginning of your career you were expecting that, and then immediately you realized, gosh, actually no, as a translator I need to be very sort of plugged in to lots of networks. Or has that changed perhaps over the course of your career? Is it something that now that we're so much more online, has that made a big difference as well to the way that you work in collaborations?
Well, when I started, it was before technology. So translators were very isolated. They didn't know each other. The only time we got together was the annual summer drinks party at the Translators Association in London. So anyone who couldn't get to London, I mean, a lot of translators really did not know anybody else. And I remember organizing a workshop at the Translators Association, very early days, a sort of translation clinic. And I thought it would be beginners coming along. And it was all very, very distinguished translators, people like Ewald Ozers and Patricia Crampton, who were legends, who came along and said, I have never sat in a room with other translators and discussed translation problems. So I think that what's happened is, with the growth of translator associations, the growth of international collaboration, and technology making it so much easier to communicate, and having a meeting, I mean, things like the British Centre for Literary Translation, that didn't exist. There was no central hub where translators actually got together. And the idea of translator training, I mean, even in universities then, there were not many courses. So the idea of peer training, I mean, all this is quite recent, and I think it's wonderful now the way there is this sense of community, international community, and we all talk to each other and meet.
Thank you. Yes, I love the way you were emphasizing just how productive these collaborations have been for you, and how you were quite explicit in saying, well, they help you to improve the translation. And I wonder though, we've had a question from Manisha Gupta, who asks, how can I know that this collaboration is ideal for me as a fresher in this field? What areas do I need to be concerned about? And I wonder whether, for example, your experience suggests you simply spend more time on a translation when you're collaborating, or if there are other downsides or potential downsides which one might need to be aware of.
Well, I think the most important thing is to find somebody who is compatible and who has the same approach. I mean, I know of several translators who are very distinguished, but I know I could never collaborate with them because we have very, very different approaches. And that's not to say that one's better or worse. It's just that we do it in a different way and it wouldn't work. So as I said in my talk, if you are thinking of working with somebody else, do a few pages and see how you get on. Don't embark on a whole book. And you might find, some people find it very hard to take criticism. I mean, when I first collaborated, I think it's really scary collaborating with a colleague. It feels like taking all your clothes off and feeling this has to be absolutely right. I don't want to look stupid in front of my colleagues. So my fantasy was, and it was when I was working with Lulu Norman, that she'd look at my translation and say, oh my God, this is so brilliant. I couldn't change a comma. And of course, it came back absolutely covered in her comments. So you have to be able to take that kind of really extensive editing. When somebody's in there as deeply as you are, and they find all sorts of different ways of saying things and doing things, you have to be open to that. And some people aren't. Some people aren't, I've had people coming to workshops, and when I've put them in a group, have said to me, I can't work with other people. I'm going to go and sit in a corner and do my own thing. So it's about knowing yourself and whether you can actually work in that way, and then finding somebody who has the same approach.
Thanks, Rose. Comment in the chat from Martin van der Werf. I've translated in tandem regularly, but a steady translation partner works out best for me. Ros, you've collaborated then with many other translators. Have you done more than one book with the same partner from time to time?
Yes, I mean, I've done, I think, 3 or 4 books with Lulu Norman, and with other people just because of circumstances, somebody who invited me to do a book with them or whatever. I mean, each time it's been a very positive experience.
There's thank you. There's a question in the Q&A from SM. I don't know who SM is, but thank you, SM, for your question, which is, how's your approach to translating Simenon's books? As you are a pool of translators working on this project, are you in touch with one another? Are you given guidelines by the publisher to translate Simenon's books in order to be sure to find the author's voice? Is there an appointed editor who's coordinating the overall project?
Yes, good question. So there is an overall editor who's coordinating the project, and there's several editors, copy editors, and they have put together a style sheet for certain terms that have to be consistent throughout. So, what you call maigret, whether you say monsieur or whether you translate it, I mean, all these things, all the different police ranks, etc. So there are certain things that are set in stone. But in terms of voice, we're all left to do our own thing. But obviously the editors try to ensure a certain consistency. We did all get together in the early days of the project at Senef in Belgium, the Translator Centre at Senef, run by Françoise Huimard. And we all came together, and Jean Simenon was there and our editor, and we thrashed out certain issues that came up that we were all struggling with. And we spent half a day discussing ellipses and exclamation marks. And it was extremely useful to get together at that point. But nobody's dictating the voice. We do our own thing.
Great, thank you. Now, another question from a rather opaque handle, but somebody, I think, based in Spain, who says, I'm an emerging literary translator from English to Spanish. What would you recommend me to break the ice with editors if they don't know me? I find this to be the main obstacle over the years. And in this sense, if I'm not known, who would like to collaborate with me? Okay, sorry, this is Maka. Okay, yes, this is Maka from the ESLT. So yes, if I'm not known, how am I likely to find a collaborator?
Well, I would say, I mean, there are 2 questions there. How do I get to know editors, and how do I find a collaborator? So the first question is, how do I find a collaborator? I would say network, go to translator events, join your association, and go to as many live events as possible. And I think the interesting things that happen are over coffee, on the bus, in corridors. It's there's a sort of serendipitous element to meeting people, so you need to get out there. In terms of making yourself known to editors, I don't know how things work in Spain and how open publishers are to approaches from translators. In the UK and in America, this has improved over the years, I think, particularly since there have been successful translations that have been translator-led. And we saw in the applications for Pen Translate subsidies, a lot of the publishers said this book was brought to us by the translator. I would say if you want to make approaches to editors, be seen as somebody who is proactive and who has their finger on the pulse of what's being published, rather than writing to publishers and saying, hello, I'm a new translator, got any work for me? Find books that are interesting, that haven't been translated, from some of the small independent publishers who don't have the resources to go to all the book fairs and promote their works, and find interesting books that you can propose and put together a pitch. I have some guidelines on pitching to publishers, which I can send out to anybody who's interested. Again, you know, my experience is working with English and American publishers. I don't know how this works in Spain. But I would say publishers are always on the lookout for something new and interesting. So do your homework, find out what publishers are interested in, approach publishers whose lists chime with the kind of book that you're proposing, but be proactive.
Thanks, Ros. That's really good advice. I'm wondering, I was really pleased that your experiences have been so positive, but one could certainly imagine that collaboration is not always so harmonious and productive. And perhaps you know of others who have had less positive experiences, and how do you resolve problems like that, when, because it's a very close relationship when you're working with collaboratively with another translator, isn't it? And yeah, as you were saying, and if it does go wrong, or if there are tensions, it's not as though there's a kind of translators marriage guidance council, is there?
No, that in one case that was me. I actually brokered a partnership. A colleague who had got into difficulty with a book and just couldn't meet the deadline sort of said, do you know somebody? And I put that colleague in touch with somebody else, and I thought it would work. And I think what happened, it was a question of possession. The first translator had a very close relationship with the author and felt that they sort of owned this author and it was their project. The second translator who came in was quite high-handed and I think possibly dictatorial, and they had very differing approaches. And then they argued about whose name should go first, and it was quite a difficult one. So I think that, again, I think you have to find out beforehand, you have to do a few pages, and you have to have the same love for the book, and the same, I suppose, willingness to accept other people's suggestions. And in this case, it was a personality conflict, and I don't think they did do a trial beforehand. So I think it's crucial to do, a dozen pages or so, and just see how, and decide how you're going to work. Is one person going to do the translation, and then the other person come in as a sort of second pair of eyes with just gentle suggestions? Are they going to take it over? And I think in the case that I'm talking about, the second person sort of took it over, and the first translator, who had this relationship with the author, felt miffed. So it's, I would say it's really something that's worth exploring, because, I just think I've learned so much from my fellow translators. And it is, when you reach a certain point in your career, how do you progress? How do you improve? And that's certainly, through having wonderful editors and working with colleagues, that's how I improve, and I'm still improving.
Thank you. And it was very generous of you in your talk to talk about your experience of mentoring and your experience with emerging translators, and pointing out that it's a two-way process, and it's not just that you're teaching them, but you're learning as well. And that's, I think, important to know for if you are an emerging translator or a mentee in a mentorship process, that it's not all, it's certainly not seen as all one-way traffic.
I think what I learned from teaching and mentoring is having to articulate my practice, because I think a lot of people who sort of started out when I did, we evolved in a kind of intuitive way. You know, I sort of did things because it sounded right or it felt right. And when you're having to explain your practice to somebody, you have to be able to articulate that. So it made me think about what I do and why I do it, and why did I change this, and why is this not working? And also, I don't have any kind of qualification in translation, so I've learned a lot from my students' theory, their theoretical essays, which has given me a framework for articulating what I do.
Thanks, Ros. There's a footnote from Astrid, from one of our ESLT participants, to your previous comments in response to the question about an emerging translator gaining a foothold with editors. And Astrid said, I'd like to add that as an emerging translator, small publishers are your best shot. They're more willing to invest time in you.
Yeah.
I think is an interesting additional comment. Miriam, again, another of our ESLT participants, she has a question asking, Ros, could you give us more details about your translation practice and experience when you co-translate? For example, translating The Little Prince, how you two translators divided the translation work, how files were shared, did you build a shared glossary and so on?
With The Little Prince?
Yes.
No, well, that I did with my daughter, who she was my sounding board. So I did the translation and I would read it out to her. And because she's very musical, she would be listening. She wasn't looking at the French. She doesn't know much French. She was just listening to the English. And at the time she was working with kids and she was still reading her own children's books. So she would just listen to me reading. And then she would just stop me if something didn't work. And she'd sort of go, too many syllables. And she was always right. And then she would read it to me. So I would hear it, my words being read by somebody else. And we just went over it and over it. So her role was really very much to do with the polishing. I mean, The Little Prince was an extraordinary experience because it's a short book and the language is very simple, and yet it was one of the hardest books I've ever translated because of the musical element of the language. And there are sentences in the French that are sort of light and airy, and the minute you translate them literally into English, they're sort of clunky and plodding. So there was a lot of playing around with words, sentence, word order, music. So that was how I worked with Chloe on The Little Prince.
And Little Prince is, of course, an illustrated book. Presumably, there were no new illustrations for your version. So
no, they used the originals, which were by Saint-Exupéry, but there is a new edition coming out next year, illustrated by Chris Riddell, the former children's laureate, which I've seen the illustrations. They are absolutely stunning.
Have you experienced then working with graphic artists, with illustrators of books you've been translating?
I've done some graphic novels, but I've not worked with the illustrators because they're a fait accompli. I mean, the illustrations exist, so I've just had to fit into the existing illustrations.
Fine, thank you. Question from Lara Hobling. What about potential awards? Can a collaboration be nominated? Or does the jury actually think, well, who are we awarding here?
Well, there was an example very recently for a prize in the States where a collaboration was shortlisted. So yes, I don't think, I mean, it's always funny when there are two names on a book, because sometimes there's a story behind it. Sometimes a first translator was commissioned and the publisher didn't like it, and then they got a second person to revise it and they both get their names on it. Sometimes it's a collaboration, but I'm not aware of any prize that says we don't accept co-translations. You just have to share the credit and the prize money.
Thank you. And I was very interested when you suggested that publishers actually in your experience, prefer collaborative translations for the reasons that you gave, that in a sense they come already pre-edited.
Exactly. So as long as they're not involved in any of the contractual things. So, you know, if you say, okay, we want a contract with both our names on it, we'll sort the money out between us. And I think with all the people I've collaborated with, one of us has been the payee and we've sorted the money out depending on who did the bulk of the work or whatever. So as long as publishers aren't caught up in any kind of ding dong about who gets paid and how much, and it's clear, I've never had a publisher say absolutely no way, won't have a collaboration.
Great. We're running out of time, and I think I've answered all. You've answered. I've put to you all the questions in the Q&A. So I think unless there are questions, no on the YouTube chat as well that I've been missing. So I think we can bring things to a close at this point. Just to say...
Sorry, my phone's ringing. I'm trying to shut it off. I can't. Right.
Just to say, for those who are participating in the ESLT, the European School, we will begin again after a lunch break in an hour and a half, and that's at 14:30 Central European Summer Time. For those who are not part of the European School but are perhaps interested to know what goes on at the European School, I've just popped the web address in the chat, and that's eslt.eu. It's an annual event, and you're very welcome to find out more and potentially to apply in future years. We very much welcome that. This session has been recorded, and we will be making the recording available afterwards. Thank you, Ros, for agreeing to that. Thank you for agreeing to have your whole talk circulated. That's very much more than we could have expected, and you've populated it with so many useful links, and I do recommend everybody to check out Ros's links afterwards, and also Ros has included her own contact details at the end of the PDF, so if you would like to get in touch with Ros after this session, then do go ahead using those contacts. But for the moment, though, can I just say again, Ros, thank you so much for a wonderful keynote, which has really established the theme in so many rich ways for us for our discussions this week. Thank you, Ros.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.